It was supposed to be a quiet retirement, the kind most people dream of after decades of hard work. A little lakeside cabin tucked into the southern hills of the state, complete with its own private bridge crossing a wide, slow-moving part of Clearwater Lake that curved around the rear of my 28-acre property like a serpent sleeping in the sun. I had bought the place years ago when the prices were still sane, back when no one was trying to convert every bit of undeveloped land into some profit-churning monstrosity, and had spent my life fixing it up piece by piece, from the docks to the boat shed, from the bridge to the dam. I reinforced myself learning, sweating, and hammering every piece of the dream into reality. The bridge had always been my pride and joy. An old truss-style span I'd refurbished with steel supports and new timber, designed to carry my trucks, boats, and the occasional ATV from the access road to my cabin and back again. But what really made the place unique, what made it valuable, wasn't the cabin or the bridge or the dock. It was the dam. See, Clearwater wasn't always one big lake. Decades ago, it was a patchwork of ponds and runoff streams. But some enterprising farmer, likely the one who built the original foundation under my place, had constructed a makeshift dam on the north end that eventually raised the water level high enough to merge the small lakes into one. And the result was that most of the shoreline, especially my side, sat higher, drier, and more accessible than anything around it. I kept it that way, quietly repairing and reinforcing that earthen dam over the years, even after county engineers had stopped paying attention to it. And as time passed and the developers came in droves, gobbling up land for resorts and retirement communities, that dam became the unspoken guardian of a $4 million lakeside development on the opposite bank, a gated HOA resort that sold itself on Serenity, lake access, and private docks. Their docks, which, unknown to them, sat below the waterline, held steady only by the dam on my land. I didn't ask for trouble. I stayed quiet, paid my taxes, and let them build their fancy resort with its wine tastings, pickleball courts, and cookie-cutter mansions all lined up like plastic toys on a shelf. I even watched without saying a word when their contractors began taking gravel from the edges of my land to build the HOA boat ramp, just assuming it was all part of the shared access easement the county had carved years ago wrong, but not worth the fight. But then Karen showed up. You know the type, mid-50s, power walks in tennis skirts, HOA president by blood oath, and speaks in legal threats disguised as neighborhood concern. She moved into Lot 1 near the gate, and within 2 weeks had mailed me a notice that my bridge was structurally unsafe and posed an aesthetic hazard to the community. Never mind that my bridge was on my land, over my water, serving my cabin, and had nothing to do with their development whatsoever. The first letter I ignored. The second came certified. The third was hand-delivered with a clipboard, a smartphone, and 2 clipboard-wielding HOA flunkies in tow, demanding I sign paperwork allowing the HOA to inspect and demolish what they called an unauthorized obstruction to lake access. I didn't even bother opening the gate. I stood at the far side of my bridge and let them shout into the wind. They didn't realize I had cameras, or maybe they did and didn't care. Either way, it escalated fast. A week later, I came home to find yellow caution tape wrapped around the bridge posts and a laminated sign zip-tied to the rail reading, "Condemned access forbidden by order of Lakeside View HOA." That was funny to me, considering the HOA had no jurisdiction past the edge of their property, let alone across the lake and onto mine. So I pulled the sign down and tossed it in the fire pit. Then I made my first mistake. I emailed them, trying to clear things up, stating in plain legal terms that my bridge was private, fully inspected, and had been there for decades long, before their development even broke ground. I included photos, deed maps, survey documents. They replied with a cease and desist order claiming I had unlawfully altered protected wetlands and was impeding access to public shorelines. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. There were no public shorelines here. The docks they claimed to own were built on land flooded by the dam, which was entirely on my acreage. But instead of arguing, I doubled down. I called a local land use attorney I knew from years back, one who liked taking down petty HOAs for sport. We reviewed the survey data, the water flow maps, the dam schematics, everything. He whistled low and said, "You realize you own their docks, right? At least technically. You've been controlling the water level that keeps those boats afloat for the last 15 years. I did realize that. I just never planned to use it. Until the bridge went missing." Yes, missing. I woke up one morning to find tire tracks in the gravel, pieces of fresh-cut timber in the water, and the entire bridge, my bridge, gone. Chainsaw marks lined the stumps. Footprints ran up and down both sides of the cut. A floating work barge. Sut beached near the shore on their side, half hiding a backhoe covered in fresh mud. I couldn't prove it immediately, but I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen, the HOA. They had destroyed private property on private land in an effort to sever my access to the road and force some kind of concession. But they didn't realize who they were messing with. They thought I was just some quiet retiree with a cabin and a camera. They had no idea I had blueprints for the dam, a legal claim to the water line, and the ability to completely upend their $1 million lakeside fantasy with the turn of a few valves. That night I walked down to the dam, checked the locks, and started planning. I called my lawyer. I filed a police report. I contacted the county water board. And then I filed a quiet lien on the HOA for damages citing unlawful destruction of infrastructure, trespassing, and interference with private access. But I didn't stop there. While Karen and her board were busy mailing me new threats and snapping selfies at HOA socials, I was working with a team of engineers to prepare the dam for controlled partial release legally. The moment they destroyed my bridge, they activated a chain of clauses in the old property charters that allowed me to regulate the water level for environmental maintenance. And when my bridge was deemed an environmental crossing point, that gave me the legal green light to initiate water flow reduction, or in this case, increase. Because if they wanted war, I was going to give them a floodgate showdown they'd never forget. The new bridge could wait. The lawyers could wait, but that dam, that was my ace in the hole, and I was ready to play it. The day the dam release began, the sky was a soft gray blanket overhead, the kind that made the lake look calm and harmless, hiding the tension building beneath the surface like a tightly drawn bowstring. I'd planned it with care, precision, and the kind of quiet patience only a man with nothing left to lose could afford. After the HOA destroyed my bridge, my lifeline, they triggered every legal mechanism I needed to unleash what I called Operation Low Tide. And while it might have sounded dramatic to anyone else, it was exactly what I needed to get their attention. The dam had been structurally sound for years, reinforced not only with new concrete and spillway regulators, but with a hidden overflow channel that I'd never used until now. The paperwork was airtight: environmental management, flood control, and shoreline preservation, all stamped and filed. I'd informed the proper agencies, given notice of the maintenance protocol, and included pictures of the damage to the bridge they demolished without authorization. Everything was clean, legal, and most importantly, strategic. The first week, the lake dropped only an inch, barely noticeable to anyone except the few fishermen who frequented the edges. But by week 2, their docks began to tilt ever so slightly, the gangplanks no longer lying flush but rising like drawn swords. HOA members posted passive-aggressive Facebook updates about the bizarre lake activity and blamed it on drought. Karen, of course, was on the front lines, organizing community awareness walks and trying to contact the Department of Natural Resources. Unfortunately for her, the DNR had already spoken to me and had the water charts and county permits to show everything was in order. Her outrage was hollow. She still didn't know the dam was entirely mine, sitting just inside my property line, shielded by trees and fencing no HOA member ever dared cross. But ignorance didn't slow her down. She ramped up her efforts: flyers, legal notices, even a desperate town hall meeting accusing me of purposeful ecological sabotage. I showed up to that meeting, sat quietly in the back with a folder of drone images, water data, and structural documentation. When Karen accused me of weaponizing water, I calmly asked the board if they'd like me to present the documentation of their illegal bridge. demolition trespassing charges, and the environmental violations their construction had triggered by removing native shoreline vegetation to make room for their floating tiki bar. The room fell silent, Karen's face drained of color. But it wasn't over yet. By week 3, the docks weren't just tilted, they were grounded, canoes sat on mud, their prized pontoon boats, which they'd proudly advertised in their luxury. Brochures were stranded in the weeds, hulls leaning sideways like dying fish. The HOA maintenance crew tried sandbagging the dock ends, hauling rocks and plastic liners to keep some illusion of shoreline alive. But it was no use. The water was still dropping, not rapidly, just steadily. A slow, intentional retreat. It was a beautiful thing to watch. Residents started getting angry, not at me, but at the Why didn't you secure water rights? They demanded. Why wasn't this in the disclosures? Karen stammered through prepared statements, blaming climate change, wildlife interference. Even beavers, yes, she blamed beavers. But people weren't buying it. They started digging into public records. They found my permits. They found the dam blueprints. They found a copy of the original land deed clearly outlining my right to regulate water levels for agricultural and maintenance purposes. I didn't have to say a word. They turned on her themselves. But the real kicker came at the end of month 1. That's when I received a visit from a very nervous-looking man in a blazer holding a settlement offer. They wanted me to stop immediately in exchange. They offered to reimburse the costs of my bridge $18,000, they claimed, though it was closer to $40,000 and the promise to stay off my property. I smiled, thanked him for his time, and handed him a counteroffer, full restitution for the bridge. A signed agreement acknowledging the HOA's lack of jurisdiction over the lake. A permanent cease and desist on any future actions involving my land, and most critically a $250,000 easement fee if they wanted water levels returned to their original height. The man blinked like I'd slapped him. You're asking for $250,000? I said no, I wasn't asking. That was the minimum price to rent my dam. He left in silence. Karen tried to spin it into a victory, saying I'd been scared into negotiations. But by now, her own residents weren't listening. A petition to remove her as HOA president gained momentum. A rogue homeowner posted drone footage of the dried-up shoreline on YouTube with the caption, "Welcome to Lake No Water." It got 70,000 views in 3 days. I watched the whole thing with a cold beer on my cabin deck, grinning while listening to the soft trickle of water disappearing down the spillway. But it wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control, ownership, respect. They thought they could bully me, cut down my bridge, paint me as the villain while trespassing on my rights and land. They thought their wealth and collective outrage could overpower one man with a dam. They thought wrong. Week 5 brought media attention. A local news crew showed up at the resort after someone tipped them off about the war on the water. I didn't even need to speak. They aired shots of the cracked docks, Karen shouting at residents, and a lovely drone flyover showing the exposed bottom of the lake around the HOA development. I supplied them with court records, historical maps, and video footage of the bridge. Being sought apart, the segment aired that evening. Public opinion flipped instantly. Suddenly, I was the quiet landowner defending his rights against corporate overreach. Karen was a pariah, but still, they didn't cave. So I opened the dam a little more, just enough to lower the level by another 6 inches. It wasn't catastrophic, it wasn't dangerous. But now the HOA's sprinkler intake lines ran dry. Their manicured front lawns wilted. The fancy lakeside event gazebo was surrounded by dry mud and cattails. A wedding had to be canceled. Refunds were demanded. The HOA began hemorrhaging money. And then finally Karen snapped. I heard it from my neighbor across the lake, who overheard the shouting through an open clubhouse window. She lost her temper in a board meeting, blamed everyone but herself, and then, in a moment of pure Karen energy, declared she would take back the dam personally. That night she trespassed. Came down the old maintenance trail with two of her friends, flashlights, and what looked like bolt cutters. I caught them on the trail cam, called the sheriff. They were intercepted before reaching the dam gate, arrested. Charged with trespassing, destruction of property, they'd broken one of my fences, and attempted tampering with county infrastructure. That was the final nail. Karen was removed as HOA president within 48 hours. Her name was scrubbed from the newsletter. Residents filed a class action against the board for mismanagement and failure to disclose infrastructure liabilities. The new HOA president, a soft-spoken former accountant named Glenn, came to my door personally. No lawyers, no threats, just a clipboard and a sincere apology. He asked what it would take to restore peace. I handed him the same offer I gave weeks ago, but with a small change. The easement fee had gone up. $400,000 now. Take it or leave it. He blinked, nodded, said he'd speak to the board. 3 days later, I had a cashier's check in my mailbox. I closed the overflow channel that evening. Water levels began to rise within a week. The lake returned to its full height a month later. Their docks floated again. The sprinkler pumps resumed. Weddings were rebooked. They even sent me a thank you note and signed, of course. But I kept the check framed in my office. Every time I look at it, I remember the bridge they destroyed. The way they underestimated the man across the water. The way they thought money, threats, and HOA muscle could drown out quiet resolve. They never realized the dam wasn't just holding back water, it was holding back me. And once I opened it, there was no stopping what flowed downstream. The fallout from draining the lake didn't just ripple through the HOA. It detonated like a bomb across every level of their operations, and the aftershocks kept coming for months. Once, Glenn handed me that $400,000 check, and the lake began to rise again. You'd think the HOA would have learned their lesson. But like all self-righteous bureaucracies built on arrogance and denial, they had one more card to play: a lawsuit. They tried to sue me, not just for economic damages, but for emotional distress, business interruption, and defamation. The high-priced legal firm sent a 92-page complaint outlining everything from the humiliation of dried docks to Karen's unjust arrest, all while conveniently ignoring the fact that they destroyed a private bridge on land they didn't own. Their case was weak, fabricated, padded with speculation, and based on public perception rather than hard evidence. But weak lawsuits can still cause trouble. Their strategy was to exhaust me, bury me in motions and discovery requests until I folded or settled quietly. But what they didn't realize yet again was that I'd been preparing for this since the day they took down my bridge. I had already retained a legal bulldog of my own, a retired Army JAG officer turned property rights specialist named Ellen Thorne. She didn't do small talk. She did litigation like a flamethrower, and when she read their complaint, she chuckled, then cracked her knuckles and said, "Let's turn this around." Within 2 weeks, we had a countersuit filed: trespassing, destruction of property, attempted tampering with critical infrastructure, harassment, and thanks to Ellen's sharp eyes, a RICO angle involving coordinated HOA board actions to pressure private landowners into surrendering property access. Suddenly, their playbook flipped. The judge allowed both cases to proceed side by side, and discovery became a minefield for them. Emails surfaced. Not just Karen's tirades, but internal HOA messages between board members actively plotting how to phase out my ownership by choking access points and isolating my cabin. One email even called me the last weed to pull. Ellen had it blown up on a courtroom screen. The silence was deafening. Depositions were even worse for them. One former HOA board member cracked under questioning and admitted the bridge demolition wasn't accidental clearing, as they'd claimed, but a deliberate removal approved in an unrecorded vote during an off-books meeting at Karen's house that sealed the deal. The jury never even had to deliberate because the HOA folded the moment the judge allowed that testimony in. Settlement came fast, furious, and very public. They paid out a total of $1.2 million in damages covering my legal fees. bridge reconstruction with upgrades, land use compensation, and a legally binding agreement never to touch or influence water levels or shoreline development on my property again. But by that point, the damage to their reputation was irreversible. Their resort? Canceled bookings, lawsuits, refund demands. Vendors pulled out. The local Chamber of Commerce rescinded their membership. Realtors removed the phrase lakefront access from listings. But here's where it gets poetic, my new bridge. It became the only viable launch point for lake activities, thanks to my side of the lake being deeper and less affected by sediment during the drain. Residents, desperate to salvage their summer season, asked politely this time if they could use the launch ramp I'd built. For a fee, of course. I created the Lake Passage Pass, an annual license allowing controlled, limited access from my side of the bridge, $1,200 per household. I sold out in 2 days. HOA residents were practically lining up with checks. Glenn, the new president, apologized again, this time in front of a community meeting where I was a guest speaker. He even invited me to join the board. I politely declined. I preferred watching from my deck, but that wasn't the end. Not quite, because now I had momentum. I used the settlement funds and licensing income to expand, bought the adjacent plot of land beside my cabin, a forgotten strip of woods that bordered the HOA walking trail. Then I purchased the old bait shack at the lake's northern edge, turning it into a combination rental kiosk and ranger post. That gave me practical control of water recreation across 2/3 of the lake perimeter. I hired local teens to run it during the summer, clean boats, manage launches, monitor noise. It became one of the most well-run lakefronts in the county, and every kayak, paddleboard, and pontoon boat that touched the water did so with my logo branded on the side, Bridge Back Rentals. The name made HOA members twitch. But I kept everything. Professional, polite, profitable. I even offered discounts to elderly residents and veterans. Meanwhile, Karen vanished from public life. Moved out, according to the grapevine, sold her house at a loss. Rumor had it she tried to sue the HOA for scapegoating her, irony, served cold. But in her absence, the HOA tried to rebrand. They launched community picnics, water cleanup events, a Healing the Lake campaign. I let them play pretend, so long as they didn't forget who controlled the dam. And when developers came sniffing around eyeing the vacant stretch between their resort and the highway, I made another move. Bought the access road. Just a simple gravel stretch, 1/2 mile long, once owned by the county, but quietly auctioned off as surplus. I got it for $32,000. That road? It connected their future expansion plans to the main highway. Without it, they were trapped. I didn't block access, I just charged tolls. Commercial vehicles paid premium. Trucks hauling construction gear paid triple, and anyone without a pass turned away at the gate I installed, complete with cameras and a solar-powered security system. By the following summer, my earnings from access fees alone had paid off the entire purchase. The HOA begged the county to seize the road via eminent domain, but the county laughed. He bought it fair and legal. You people never even bid. It was glorious. My quiet revenge wasn't about yelling or slashing tires or breaking laws. It was about patience, paperwork, and property rights. And every day, as I walked across the new steel and concrete bridge they once destroyed, I reminded myself of a simple truth: never underestimate the man at the edge of the lake. He might just own the dam, the road, the launch, and the silence that follows your collapse. They built their paradise on arrogance. I rebuilt mine on leverage. And when the waters rose again, it wasn't mercy. It was business. By the time the 4th summer rolled around, what had started as a feud over a bridge had transformed into a full-blown power shift, one that flipped the entire community dynamic and left the HOA reduced to a hollow shell of the authority it once flaunted. I didn't need to gloat. My name was etched in the deeds, the water rights, the land access contracts, and most importantly, the respect of every resident who now understood that the quiet man by the lake wasn't to be underestimated. But peace, as I had come to learn, is never permanent where HOAs are concerned. Glenn had tried to reform things, bringing transparency and civility to the meetings, but the old guard hadn't completely vanished. New Karens cropped up like weeds, whispering about how it's time to take back the lake, petitioning to reassert control over shared access, and once again making assumptions that power could override property law. But what they didn't realize was that I'd gone even further behind the scenes this time. I had quietly joined the Zoning Advisory Council for the county, contributed to the Conservation Board, and even leased part of my land to the local fire department as a base for their new lake rescue outpost. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was a stakeholder in every sense of the word. And when a few HOA board hopefuls submitted a development plan that would have expanded their resort across protected wetlands on my boundary, they didn't just face opposition. They ran straight into a bureaucratic wall I had built over 3 years of strategic influence, denied unanimously. Their anger boiled again. So they tried another old tactic: nuisance violations. Overnight, I started receiving letters citing me for visual clutter near the bridge, unauthorized commercial activity because of my rental business, and even unpermitted signage. Because of a wooden plaque I had installed bearing the words, "Bridge rebuilt, lessons learned." But I was prepared. Every structure had permits. Every business registration was current. Every piece of tax documentation was flawless. I had even gone a step further and secured a wildlife conservation easement on part of my property, meaning any harassment or encroachment would now also be a state-level offense. When the HOA sent a drone to survey my property from above, I filed a cease and desist that cited both FAA low-altitude flight guidelines and local privacy ordinances. That drone? It never flew again. The final nail came when they attempted to stage a legal challenge and injunction to block all vehicle access across my bridge due to community disruption. But this time I didn't fight it alone. Dozens of residents, including families who had used my rentals, senior citizens who had enjoyed lakeside access, and even local business owners who depended on the foot traffic, all testified on my behalf. What was once me against a board became the community versus a handful of bitter control freaks. The court didn't just dismiss the injunction. The judge issued a formal rebuke, warning the HOA that continued harassment could constitute systemic abuse of process. Within a month, 3 of their remaining board members resigned. The HOA president stepped down. And with no one left to fight, the fight ended. For good. I bought the abandoned HOA community center at auction, remodeled it into a multi-purpose space with free workshops for lake education, boating safety, and property rights awareness. The same room where Karen once shouted about her lake was now the place where teenagers learned CPR and elderly residents learned how to paddleboard. I named it the Bridge House. As poetic justice goes, that one felt particularly sweet. But the greatest victory wasn't financial or legal. It was generational. Parents brought their kids to launch kayaks off my dock, telling them how the lake had almost been lost to greed and mismanagement. Some even joked that the HOA had messed with the wrong neighbor and learned the hard way. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't have to. The lake told its own story now. Calm, deep, and under control, just like me. One day I received a letter, not a demand, not a threat, just an envelope unmarked except for my name. Inside was a photograph, old, black and white, of the original bridge that once spanned the water, long before any resort, HOA, or modern cabin existed. It was dated 1947. On the back, a handwritten note. It always belonged to the ones who cared for it. No name, no sender. I framed it and hung it inside the bridge house, where sunlight touched it every morning. It reminded me why I fought. Why I didn't back down. Why property isn't just land, but legacy. And for every future HOA that might one day rise and think their rules outweigh deeds, rights, and quiet resolve, I have a story, a bridge, a dam, and a drained resort to show them otherwise. Because some people build fences, others build leverage. And I build bridges. Just make sure you don't tear mine down.